By 1943, the United States was fully mobilized for total war. Its factories were churning out tanks and bombers at an unprecedented rate. Its sons were fighting and dying across North Africa, Italy, and the Pacific. The entire nation was united in a singular, ferocious effort to destroy the Axis powers. Yet, hiding in plain sight across the American heartland, a bizarre and seemingly contradictory phenomenon was taking place. In crowded train stations from New York to California, American civilians often watched in stunned disbelief as sleek passenger trains rolled by. Inside, sitting on cushioned seats, laughing, smoking cigarettes, and eating decent meals were thousands of young men in crisp, unfamiliar uniforms. They were soldiers of the Wehrmacht, the sworn enemies of the United States, traveling in better conditions than many American GIs who were often packed into older troop transport cars on the same rail lines. This surreal sight was just the public face of one of the largest and most successful yet least understood operations of World War II, the internment of nearly 425,000 German prisoners of war on American soil. These men, raised on the hateful rhetoric of Nazism and taught that America was a degenerate, gangster-ridden wasteland, found themselves dropped into the very center of American life. They were held in a sprawling network of over 700 main camps and branch camps located in all but 2 of the 48 states. They became an omnipresent, almost routine part of life for millions of Americans, harvesting crops in Nebraska, canning tomatoes in Indiana, logging forests in Maine, and even waiting tables in Army mess halls. What happened in these camps was a massive, unplanned sociological experiment. It was a collision between the rigid indoctrination of the Third Reich and the messy, abundant, and surprisingly lenient reality of American democracy. For the prisoners, it was a psychological earthquake that shattered their worldview. For the Americans, it was a test of their own stated values. Could a democracy maintain its humanity while holding hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers captive? The answer to that question would shape the post-war world in profound ways. It would turn hundreds of thousands of hardened enemies into lifelong ambassadors for American values, leading many to later utter the famous, paradoxical phrase, "We may have lost the war, but in America we found our humanity." To understand this massive transformation, we must go back to the beginning, to the moment of capture and the intricate web of international law, logistics, and psychology that brought Hitler's army to the American hinterland. The flood of prisoners began as a trickle in 1942, but turned into a deluge following the collapse of the Afri Corps in Tunisia in May 1943. Suddenly, the Allies were responsible for over 250,000 Axis prisoners, nearly half of them German. Britain, already strained to its breaking point by years of war and rationing, simply could not feed or house them. The solution was obvious, if logistically daunting: ship them to the United States. The Liberty ships that brought American troops and supplies to the European theater were returning with empty holds. They became the primary transport vessels for a massive transatlantic movement of human cargo. For the average German soldier captured in North Africa, this journey was a terrifying prospect. Nazi propaganda had been lethally effective. They had been told that American transport ships were routinely torpedoed by German U-boats and that the Americans would leave prisoners locked below decks to drown. They were told that if they did reach America, they would be paraded through mobs of angry civilians who would stone them before being shipped to desolate work camps in the frozen wastes of Alaska or Death Valley to die of exposure. The fear was visceral. When boarding the ships, many prisoners had to be forcibly pushed up the gangplanks, convinced they were walking to their deaths. The reality of the voyage was the first major crack in this propaganda facade. While conditions below decks were crowded and uncomfortable, they were rarely lethal. The dreaded U-boat attacks on these westbound convoys rarely materialized in late 1943 and 1944 as Allied anti-submarine supremacy grew. Instead of being left to drown, prisoners found themselves being fed. The U.S. Navy, adhering strictly to its own regulations, provided prisoners with 2 substantial meals a day during the crossing. For men who had been surviving on meager Wehrmacht field rations, often little more than hard biscuits, thin soup, and ersatz coffee, the sheer caloric density of American food was shocking. One prisoner later recalled his first meal aboard a transport ship, a thick slab of white bread with real butter and a tin of corned beef. He ate it slowly, convinced it was a prisoner's last meal before execution. When breakfast arrived the next morning, powdered eggs, more bread, and hot coffee, his confusion only deepened. Upon arrival in major ports like Boston, New York, or Norfolk, the dreaded angry mobs were nowhere to be seen. Instead, the prisoners were met by efficient military police detachments, deloused, a humiliating but necessary public health measure that many resented, issued new clothing, and immediately put on trains west. It was this train journey that broke the morale of many die-hard Nazis. In Europe, a soldier could cross 2 or 3 countries in a few days. In America, they traveled for days on end, from the lush green of the East Coast, across the endless flat expanse of the Great Plains, over the towering Rocky Mountains, and into the deserts of the Southwest, without ever reaching a border. The sheer staggering size of the United States was a military fact that no amount of propaganda could counter. Prisoners would stare out the windows at the endless miles of untouched farmland, the massive industrial centers of Chicago and Detroit operating under bright lights all night long, unlike the blacked-out cities of Europe, and the endless stream of military trains heading in the opposite direction, loaded with tanks, trucks, and aircraft. One German officer, after 3 days of watching the American landscape roll by, reportedly slumped in his seat and muttered to his fellow officers, "Gentlemen, we have lost. They have so much space, they don't even know what to do with it." They realized they had attacked a continent-spanning industrial giant with resources they couldn't even fathom. When they finally arrived at their destination camps, the cognitive dissonance reached its peak. The United States government had made a strategic decision early in the war. It would adhere strictly, even rigidly, to the 1929 Geneva Convention regarding the treatment of prisoners of war. This was not purely out of humanitarian altruism. There were thousands of American boys held in German POW camps in Europe. The War Department believed that treating German prisoners well was the best insurance policy for the safety of their own men. If word reached Berlin that German prisoners were being mistreated, Hitler would almost certainly retaliate against captive Americans. The result was a camp system that, to the ragged and often starving German soldiers, seemed like a fantastical luxury resort. Standard camps were built to a uniform army blueprint, rows of sturdy wooden barracks, heated by coal or wood stoves, with designated mess halls, washrooms with hot running water, and recreation areas. In a standard 1,000-man compound, there was 40 square feet of sleeping space per man, more than many had in their own homes, let alone in the German army barracks. But the most overwhelming aspect of camp life was the food. The Geneva Convention stipulated that prisoners must receive food equal in quantity and quality to that of the captor nation's base troops. In the U.S. Army of 1943, that meant a staggering 4,000 calories a day. The camp menus from this period are almost unbelievable in the context of a global war plagued by starvation. Breakfast might include eggs, bacon, cereal, milk, bread, and coffee. Dinner, lunch, could be roast beef, potatoes, gravy, 2 types of vegetables, pie, and more coffee. Supper might be cold cuts, cheese, potato salad, and fruit. For Germans who had been living on less than half that amount, often consisting of low-quality fillers, this was overwhelming. Camp commanders reported a common phenomenon among new arrivals, the Fresswell or gluttony wave. Prisoners would gorge themselves until they were physically ill, unable to stop because their deeply ingrained scarcity mindset told them this abundance couldn't possibly last. They would hoard food, hiding bread and sausages under their mattresses until the stench forced American guards to conduct barracks inspections to clear out the rotting stashes. It took weeks, sometimes months, for them to trust that the next meal would actually arrive. Beyond the necessities, camp life offered amenities that many average Germans had never experienced. The camps had canteens, PXs, where prisoners could use camp scrip, earned through labor or issued as a small monthly allowance to officers, to buy luxuries. They could purchase cigarettes, chocolate, soda, beer, often 3.2% near beer, but still highly valued, toiletries, and even writing paper. The camps had libraries, often stocked by the YMCA or international relief agencies, which eventually included books banned in Nazi Germany. There were soccer fields, ping-pong tables, and theaters where they could watch American movies or stage their own elaborate productions. In Camp Cornobia, Kansas, the prisoners organized a full symphony orchestra using instruments donated by local charities or purchased through the canteen. In other camps, they formed university-level education systems, with captured German professors giving lectures on physics, law, and history to soldiers who had never finished high school. It was a golden cage. A life of monotonous confinement, yes, but one of staggering material comfort compared to the hell of the Eastern Front or the bombed-out cities their families were enduring back home. This comfort was a psychological weapon in itself. It was impossible to maintain the belief that Americans were barbaric, culturally inferior gangsters when they were feeding you better than your own Führer ever had. However, portraying these camps as idyllic sanctuaries would be a profound historical error. Beneath the calm surface of soccer games and symphony orchestras, a brutal, deadly political war was being fought inside the barracks. The camps were not politically homogeneous. The prisoner population was a cross-section of German society, containing everything from deeply cynical, battle-weary veterans who just wanted to survive, to fanatical, hardcore Nazis who viewed their captivity as merely a new front in the war. Early in the war, the U.S. Army made a critical mistake. Lacking enough German-speaking guards or intelligence officers, they often allowed the prisoners to organize their own internal camp leadership. Relying on typical military hierarchy, they let the highest-ranking German non-commissioned officers, NCOs, take charge of daily discipline within the barracks. Unfortunately, in 1943 and early 1944, these NCOs were often the most ardent Nazis, men who had risen through the ranks because of their political reliability as much as their combat skill. The result was a reign of terror inside many camps. These Nazi hardliners organized what American camp commanders later called the Camp Gestapo. They enforced rigid discipline, monitored their fellow prisoners for any sign of defeatism or cooperation with the Americans, and meted out brutal punishments. Prisoners who spoke too respectfully to American guards, who expressed doubts about Germany's final victory, or who volunteered too eagerly for work details could find themselves beaten in their bunks at night. In extreme cases, this internal war led to murder. These were often staged as honorable suicides. A prisoner deemed a traitor by the Camp Gestapo would be given a length of rope and told that for the sake of his family's honor back in Germany, he must take his own life. If he refused, he would be beaten to death, and it would be made to look like an accident. Or the entire barracks would simply refuse to cooperate with the investigation, presenting a wall of silence that American authorities found impossible to break. One of the most infamous cases occurred at Camp Tonkawa in Oklahoma. A prisoner named Johannes Kunze was accused by fellow prisoners of passing information to American intelligence officers. On November 4, 1943, he was beaten to death by dozens of fellow prisoners using milk bottles and pieces of lumber. 5 German NCOs were eventually tried, convicted, and executed by the U.S. government for the murder, but it was a stark wake-up call to American authorities. They realized they had lost control of the internal life of the camps to fanatic elements. This led to a massive, belated effort to segregate the camps. American intelligence officers began the daunting task of screening every single prisoner to determine their political leanings. They established 3 broad categories: Nazis, die-hard loyalists; anti-Nazis, often older men, communists, or those persecuted by the regime before the war; and the vast middle ground of apolitical prisoners who just followed whoever was in charge. To deal with the hardliners, the Army created special high-security segregation camps, most notably Camp Alva in Oklahoma. Camp Alva was known among the prisoners as the Nazi camp or simply Alcatraz. It housed the most dangerous, influential, and disruptive Nazis, isolating them so they couldn't infect the other camps with their ideology. Conversely, designated anti-Nazis were sent to special camps where they were given greater freedom and eventually became the core of the re-education efforts. This segregation was crucial. It broke the stranglehold of the fanatics and allowed the majority of the prisoners the mental space to actually begin questioning the ideology they had been force-fed for a decade. While the internal political struggles raged in the barracks, a much more public and transformative process was taking place outside the wire. By 1943, the United States was facing a severe manpower crisis. Millions of working-age men were in uniform overseas. The booming war industries were absorbing every available worker left on the home front, including women, who were entering the workforce in unprecedented numbers. This left a critical vacuum in 2 vital sectors: agriculture and food processing. Crops were literally rotting in the fields for lack of hands to harvest them. The War Department initially resisted using POW labor outside the camps due to security concerns, but the pressure from agricultural lobbies and desperate farmers became overwhelming. In mid-1943, the Army launched a massive POW labor program. Under strict adherence to the Geneva Convention, enlisted prisoners could be required to work, provided the work was not directly related to the war effort, like manufacturing munitions, was not dangerous, and that they were paid. Officers could volunteer to work but could not be compelled. The pay system was ingenious. Farmers and businesses paid the U.S. government the prevailing local wage for the prisoners' labor. The government then paid the prisoners 80 cents a day in camp script, roughly equivalent to $14 today, keeping the difference to offset the cost of the POW program. It was a win-win. Farmers got reliable labor, the government reduced the cost of internment, and prisoners got something to do, plus money to buy small luxuries like chocolate, tobacco, and beer at the camp canteen. Soon, hundreds of thousands of German POWs were being trucked out of camps every morning to work on farms, in canning factories, and in logging camps. This massive deployment of enemy soldiers into civilian communities was initially met with fear and hostility. Local newspapers ran fierce editorials against coddling the enemy, while American boys were dying overseas. Farmers were terrified of having Nazis around their families. But the reality of daily interaction quickly broke down these barriers. Farmers discovered that most of the prisoners were just young men, many from rural backgrounds themselves, who knew how to handle a team of horses or fix a tractor. They were often diligent, disciplined workers, grateful to be out of the boring confines of the camp. The Nazi monsters of propaganda turned out to be quiet, hard-working boys named Hans or Fritz who missed their own farms back in Germany. It was here, in the cornfields of Nebraska, the cotton fields of Texas, and the orchards of Michigan, that the real humanization occurred. Technically, prisoners were supposed to eat a cold army sack lunch in the fields, separate from their employers. But thousands of pragmatic American farmers couldn't abide watching men work hard all morning only to eat a cold sandwich in the dirt while the family had a hot meal inside. Rules were bent, then broken entirely. Soon, prisoners were being invited onto porches for lemonade, then into kitchens for lunch. They shared meals with American families, struggling through language barriers to talk about the weather, the crops, and eventually their families. They saw photographs of American sons in uniform on mantelpieces, sons who might be fighting their own brothers in Europe. These shared moments of vulnerability created a profound, unspoken bond. The ideological hatred preached by Hitler couldn't survive the simple, shared humanity of passing a plate of potatoes at a family dinner table. While farm labor was winning hearts, a secret, highly sophisticated program was instituted to win minds. The U.S. government realized that simply defeating Germany militarily wouldn't be enough if a generation of fanatical Nazis returned home to restart the cycle of aggression. They needed to be denazified before they were repatriated. This led to the creation of the Special Projects Division, SPD, a covert branch of the Provost Marshal General's office. Its mission was intellectual diversion, a euphemism for a massive re-education program designed to instill democratic values. The program was secret because exposing it as propaganda would have destroyed its credibility with the prisoners and potentially violated the Geneva Convention's rules against ideological indoctrination. The SPD didn't use brute force brainwashing. Instead, they used a soft power approach, leveraging the prisoners' own desire for education and entertainment. They identified anti-Nazi prisoners, often intellectuals, former journalists, or educators who had been drafted, and quietly empowered them to lead the effort from within the camps. The centerpiece was their Roof, The Call, a high-quality national POW newspaper edited by trusted anti-Nazi prisoners at Fort Kearny, Rhode Island. It was distributed to all camps and provided something the prisoners had never had: objectively truthful, unsanitized news about the war, including German defeats. It also featured high-level literary and cultural articles that reconnected prisoners with the rich, pre-Nazi humanistic traditions of German culture, reminding them of Goethe, Schiller, and Beethoven, rather than just Hitler and Himmler. Simultaneously, the SPD flooded the camps with books, films, and educational materials. They carefully selected American movies that showed ordinary life, the messy vibrancy of democracy, and the power of the individual. Films like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington or adaptations of Mark Twain. They offered university-level courses, allowing prisoners to earn credits that would later be honored by post-war German universities. They even created an elite democracy school at Fort Eustis, Virginia, where carefully selected prisoners were given intensive training in democratic history, civil rights, and American government. These men were then sent back to other camps to act as missionaries of democracy, quietly influencing their peers. The genius of the program was that it didn't tell them democracy was better, it gave them the tools and the freedom to discover it for themselves. The ultimate test of this re-education came in the spring of 1945, as Allied troops liberated the Nazi concentration camps. The world was horrified by the images of emaciated corpses stacked like cordwood at Buchenwald, Dachau, and Bergen-Belsen. The U.S. War Department decided that the German POWs needed to see exactly what their government had done. Viewing these atrocity films became mandatory in every POW camp. The reactions were visceral and varied. Some die-hard Nazis dismissed them as Hollywood fabrications, fake propaganda designed to shame them. But for the vast majority, the experience was shattering. Accounts from camp guards describe prisoners leaving the screening rooms pale, trembling, some vomiting or openly weeping. Many had known about the camps in the abstract or had heard rumors, but seeing the undeniable, graphic reality was a completely different psychological blow. It forced a devastating confrontation with their own complicity. They had fought for a regime that had committed unparalleled mass murder. For many, this was the final breaking point of their old worldview. The honor of the Wehrmacht, the supposed nobility of their cause, it all dissolved in the face of those horrific images. The kindness they had experienced in America now stood in even starker contrast to the barbarity of their own nation. It created a profound moral debt that many felt compelled to repay for the rest of their lives. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, the 370,000 German POWs still in the United States might have expected an immediate return home. Instead, they faced a new, frustrating limbo. The Geneva Convention allows for the repatriation of prisoners as soon as possible after the conclusion of peace. But with Germany completely defeated, occupied, and lacking a functioning government to sign a peace treaty, the conclusion of peace was a legally murky concept. Furthermore, the Allies desperately needed labor to rebuild a shattered Europe. The U.S. government, facing immense pressure from France and Britain, agreed to transfer tens of thousands of its German prisoners to its allies for post-war reconstruction labor. This news was met with terror in the American camps. Prisoners knew conditions in French and British camps were far harsher, with vastly inferior food and housing. They had spent years in the golden cage of America and were now terrified of being sent to what they viewed as slave labor camps in Europe. Ultimately, most POWs remained in the U.S. until 1946. During this final year, the fraternization ban was officially lifted. Prisoners could now openly socialize with American civilians. The relationships that had begun secretly in farm kitchens now flourished in the open. In towns near camps, it became common to see German prisoners attending local churches on Sundays, invited by the families they worked for. Some even began dating local American women, relationships that were scandalous to some but spoke to the deep bonds that had formed. When the time for repatriation finally came in 1946, the scenes at the train stations and docks were deeply emotional. American farmers came to see their boys off, often pressing small gifts of money, food, or clothing into their hands, items that would be invaluable in starving Germany. The prisoners, once feared as Nazi monsters, were now wept over by American mothers who had come to see them as surrogate sons. The return to Germany was a brutal shock. After years of being well-fed and housed in America, they stepped off ships in Europe into a dystopian nightmare. Germany was a landscape of rubble, hunger, and complete societal collapse. In the hunger winter of 1946-1947, thousands of Germans died of starvation and cold. It was in this darkest hour that the bonds forged in America proved literally life-saving. Thousands of former POWs wrote desperate letters to the farmers and families they had worked for in America, describing the dire conditions. The response was an overwhelming, grassroots outpouring of generosity. American families, many of whom had lost their own sons fighting the Germans, began sending massive numbers of care packages to their former prisoners. These packages, filled with coffee, sugar, flour, lard, and warm clothing, were more than just supplies. They were a lifeline of hope, a tangible reaffirmation that the humanity they had found in America was real and enduring. This experience had a profound, long-term impact on post-war Germany. The millions of men who returned from American camps became the founding generation of the new West German democracy. Having lived in a functioning democracy, having seen its immense power and its surprising decency, they were inoculated against the totalitarian temptations that had doomed the Weimar Republic. They became teachers, mayors, business leaders, and fathers who raised their children not with Prussian militarism, but with the values of tolerance and individual liberty they had seen in practice in places like Nebraska and Texas. Historically, it is one of the most successful examples of mass re-education and reconciliation in human history. It wasn't achieved primarily through lectures or books, though those helped. It was achieved through the quiet, everyday diplomacy of ordinary Americans, farmers, shopkeepers, and guards, who, by simply living their values and treating their enemies with basic human dignity, won a victory far greater and more lasting than any achieved on the battlefield. They didn't just defeat an army, they turned it into a generation of friends. To truly grasp the scale of the interaction between German POWs and American civilians, we must look beyond the occasional shared dinner and understand the sheer economic necessity that drove them together. By late 1943, the United States faced a paradox. It was the arsenal of democracy, feeding and arming the Allied world, yet it was running out of the men needed to maintain that arsenal. The draft had pulled over 10 million men out of the civilian workforce. In the agricultural sector, this was catastrophic. Crops were ripening with no one to harvest them. The War Manpower Commission estimated a shortage of nearly 4 million workers in 1944. Into this desperate void stepped the German POWs. The program was not just a casual arrangement, it was a massive, centrally managed federal enterprise that likely saved the American agricultural economy from collapse during the critical years of 1944 and 1945. The U.S. Army, initially reluctant to let prisoners outside the wire due to security fears, was compelled by congressional pressure from farm state representatives to release them for work. The scale of this labor program was staggering. In 1944 alone, POWs, mostly German with some Italian, worked a total of 34.5 million man-days in American agriculture. They were not just engaged in light gardening. They were essential to heavy, industrial-scale farming. In the South, they saved the cotton harvest, picking massive quotas that rivaled experienced local laborers. In the heavily forested regions of Michigan, Minnesota, and Maine, thousands of Afrika Korps veterans were sent into the woods as lumberjacks. These pulpwood camps were brutal, isolated, and vital, providing the raw material for everything from paper for ration books to cellulose for explosives. The Tomato Salvation of Indiana in 1944 is a prime example. A massive bumper crop of tomatoes, crucial for canning to feed troops overseas, was at risk of rotting in the fields. Local labor was non-existent. In a frantic operation, thousands of German POWs were trucked in from surrounding camps. They worked nearly around the clock, harvesting and then processing the tomatoes in local canning factories. These factories, often staffed by American women, suddenly found themselves integrated with enemy soldiers. The initial tension was incredibly high. Factory managers feared sabotage, imagining glass shards or poison being slipped into the cans. Instead, they found the Germans to be meticulously efficient. Many POWs later admitted that working in a food factory was a dream assignment. It meant unlimited access to snacks and a warm, sweet-smelling environment compared to cold fields. The result was a record pack of tomato products, entirely saved by the enemy. The sabotage rate was virtually zero. In fact, the Army reported that German prisoners were often more productive and disciplined than the transient civilian labor they replaced. This labor wasn't free, and its financial structure is a fascinating footnote of the war. The Geneva Convention required prisoners be paid. The U.S. government didn't want POW labor to undercut American wages, so farmers had to pay the government the prevailing local wage for each prisoner, say $3 a day. The government then kept the bulk of this to offset the immense cost of housing and feeding the prisoners, paying the POW only 80 cents a day and canteen scrip. In essence, the German army helped finance its own imprisonment in America. By the end of the war, the POW labor program had generated over $230 million for the U.S. Treasury, equivalent to over $3 billion today. making it one of the few government programs in history to turn a profit. The internal life of the camps was far more complex than just Nazis versus anti-Nazis. There was a profound generational and experiential divide that defined camp culture, often tied directly to when and where the prisoners were captured. The first major wave of prisoners, arriving in 1943, were veterans of Erwin Rommel's elite Afrika Korps. These men were the cream of the early Wehrmacht, young, fit, highly disciplined, and deeply indoctrinated after years of early victories. They had surrendered in Tunisia not because they were broken, but because they ran out of fuel and ammunition. When they arrived in camps like Camp Concordia in Kansas or Camp Aliceville in Alabama, they marched in perfect formation, singing distinctively aggressive Nazi marching songs. They maintained iron discipline, greeted each other with the Heil Hitler salute, which was allowed under established military courtesy rules of the time, and remained supremely confident that Germany would win the war. They viewed their time in America as a temporary vacation until the Führer negotiated their release. These Afrikaners, as they were sometimes called, were the hardest nut for American authorities to crack. They were resistant to re-education, viewed any kindness as weakness, and ruthlessly enforced Nazi discipline within their barracks. They were the ones most likely to organize the honor courts to punish perceived traitors. Then came the second massive wave, following D-Day in June 1944. These prisoners were radically different. The German army by 1944 was scraping the bottom of the manpower barrel. These new arrivals included terrified teenagers, some as young as 16, and weary older men in their 40s and 50s who had been drafted as a last resort. They also included large numbers of non-German conscripts, Poles, Czechs, and even Russians who had been forced into German uniforms. These men had seen the Wehrmacht crumbling. They had experienced the overwhelming horror of Allied air superiority, something the Afrika Korps had largely missed in its prime. They arrived in America exhausted, disillusioned, and often traumatized. They didn't march, they shuffled. They didn't sing Nazi anthems, they just wanted to sleep and eat. The friction between these two groups was intense. The Afrika Korps veterans viewed the Normandy captives as pathetic defeatists and cowards. The Normandy captives viewed the Afrika Korps veterans as delusional fanatics who didn't know the war was already lost. American camp commanders learned to use this split to their advantage, often physically separating the groups to prevent violence, but also realizing that the new arrivals were prime candidates for the labor program and re-education, while the older diehards needed to be isolated in high-security camps like Camp Alva. Nothing illustrates the psychological impact of America's vastness more than the history of German escape attempts. Out of nearly 425,000 German prisoners held in the U.S. during the war, only 2,222 ever attempted to escape, less than 1%. By contrast, Allied prisoners in Germany attempted escape at vastly higher rates. Even more remarkably, not a single German escapee successfully made it back to Germany from the United States. Why so few attempts? The answer lies in a combination of geography and luxury. In Europe, an escaping American POW might only need to travel a few hundred miles to reach neutral Switzerland or make contact with the French resistance. In America, a German POW who escaped Camp Trinata in Colorado faced 1,000 miles of mountains, deserts, or prairies just to reach where? Canada was Allied territory. Mexico was nominally Allied and far away. The Atlantic Ocean was an insurmountable barrier. Most escapes were profoundly unserious, driven more by boredom or a desire for a brief adventure than a genuine attempt to return to the war. There are dozens of recorded instances where prisoners escaped only to be found a few days later in a nearby town, having used their saved-up canteen money to go to a movie theater or buy real beer at a local tavern. They would often surrender peacefully to local police once their money ran out, happy to return to the warmth and regular meals of the camp. However, there was one spectacular exception that proved the rule, the Great Papago Park Escape of December 1944. Camp Papago Park in Arizona housed highly dedicated Kriegsmarine Navy officers, including many U-boat commanders who were considered the most intelligent and dangerous prisoners. Led by U-boat ace Jürgen Wattenberg, 25 prisoners spent months digging a magnificent 178-foot tunnel through the hard desert caliche clay. They engineered it with electric lights and ventilation, disposing of the dirt by flushing it down toilets or scattering it on sports fields, a classic Great Escape scenario. On the night of December 23, 1944, they broke out. They had maps, saved rations, and a plan to raft down the nearby river to Mexico. It was a brilliant technical achievement, but it failed immediately due to their complete misunderstanding of American geography. The river they planned to raft down, the Salt River, was, unbeknownst to them, a dry seasonal riverbed for most of the year. They found only rocks and dust. The 25 escapees scattered into the Arizona desert. Within a few weeks, nearly all had been recaptured, not by brilliant manhunts, but by hunger, thirst, and the sheer crushing vastness of the American landscape. They had experienced freedom in the American West, and it was terrifyingly empty. Most surrendered gratefully, cold and starving. Wattenberg, the last to be caught, held out for over a month, hiding in a mountain cave near Phoenix, occasionally sneaking into town to buy food with varied success until he too was captured. The lesson for the remaining 400,000 prisoners was clear. There was nowhere to go. The walls of their prison weren't made of barbed wire, but of an entire continent that was too big to fight and too big to escape. This realization broke the last vestiges of military resistance for many. If you couldn't fight and you couldn't escape, the only path left was to integrate, to learn, and to survive. If escape was a physical impossibility, social isolation was a practical one. The U.S. Army had strict non-fraternization policies. American civilians, especially women, were forbidden from anything beyond necessary professional interaction with prisoners. The penalty for breaking this rule could be severe: fines, social ostracization, or even job loss for guards who looked the other way. Yet, human nature invariably outmaneuvered military regulations. With hundreds of thousands of young, often handsome, and increasingly healthy men working in communities largely devoid of their own young male population, relationships were inevitable. In small-town America, the enemy often didn't look like a monster. He looked like the high school quarterback who was currently fighting overseas. Archives in small towns across the Midwest and South contain hushed-up records of these forbidden interactions. At Camp Holton in Maine, where prisoners worked harvesting potatoes, local women would sometimes sneak sandwiches or notes to favored prisoners through the fence or during work details. In more extreme cases, genuine romances developed. There were documented instances of American girls helping prisoners escape, not to return to Germany, but simply to spend a few hours at a local dance or in a hayloft before sneaking back into camp before roll call. One scandal that hit the national press involved two American women in Minnesota who were arrested for helping two German POWs escape their work detail for a joyride. The women were fined, but the incident revealed a growing uncomfortable truth. Many Americans simply didn't hate these men anymore. They had been around them too long. They had seen them nursing sick farm animals, fixing younger siblings' bicycles, or crying over letters from home. This softening of attitudes wasn't just romantic, it was deeply maternal. Many older American women, whose own sons were in peril overseas, began to transfer their anxieties and care onto the young German boys working on their farms. It was a psychological coping mechanism. If they took care of this mother's son, perhaps some German mother would take care of theirs if he were captured. Letters from prisoners sent back to Germany during this time often spoke with utter astonishment about this. One prisoner wrote to his parents in Hamburg, "Yesterday, the farmer's wife baked a cake for my birthday. She knew it was my birthday because she asked the guard to check my papers. I have not had a cake since 1941. Why does she do this? I am supposed to be her enemy. I think the Americans are a crazy people, but they have good hearts." While these emotional bonds were forming in the fields, an intellectual revolution was taking place inside the camps that went far beyond simple newspapers. By 1944 and 1945, many large camps had effectively become massive, functioning universities. Utilizing the astonishing number of educated men within their own ranks, professors, engineers, musicians, and theologians who had been drafted as privates, the prisoners organized curriculum that rivaled small colleges. At Camp Concordia, Kansas, over 300 different courses were offered, ranging from advanced calculus and Latin to American history and automotive repair. The U.S. government, through the YMCA and Red Cross, facilitated this by providing literally millions of books. But the most critical aspect of this education was who was allowed to teach. As the segregation program took effect and Nazi hardliners were removed, anti-Nazi intellectuals took over the camp classrooms. The ultimate expression of this was the top-secret Special Projects Center at Fort Eustis, Virginia. This was, in effect, a graduate school for democracy. The army selected the brightest, most open-minded anti-Nazi prisoners from camps across the country, roughly 25,000 men over the program's lifespan, and sent them to Eustis for intensive 6-day courses. The faculty at Fort Eustis was an irony of history that was not lost on the students. Many of the professors were German Jewish intellectuals who had fled Hitler in the 1930s. Here were men who had been stripped of their citizenship, their homes, and their careers by the Nazi regime, now returning to teach the very soldiers of that regime about the moral foundations of civilization. Instead of vengeance, these professors offered reason. They didn't berate the prisoners, they engaged them in Socratic dialogue about the failures of the Weimar Republic, the inherent contradictions of fascism, and the messy strengths of the American Constitution. For many young prisoners who had only ever known screaming demagogues, to be treated with intellectual respect by the very people their government had tried to exterminate was a shattering, transformative experience. It broke the last chains of Nazi racial ideology more effectively than any gun could. When VE Day finally arrived on May 8, 1945, the atmosphere in the American camps was not one of celebration but of profound anxiety. The war was over, but their captivity was not. In fact, it was about to enter its most dangerous phase. With the unconditional surrender of Germany, the Third Reich ceased to exist. Legally, this put the prisoners in a precarious position. The U.S. argued that since there was no longer a recognized German government to be a party to the Geneva Convention, the prisoners technically no longer had the full protections of POW status. They were reclassified as disarmed enemy forces, DEF, in Europe, though in the U.S. they largely retained their POW privileges for the time being. The immediate crisis was what to do with them. Europe was a wreck. France, in particular, demanded German labor to rebuild its shattered cities and clear millions of mines from its fields. The U.S. government, bowing to intense diplomatic pressure, agreed to transfer roughly 175,000 of its German prisoners currently held in Europe, and eventually many from the U.S., to French custody. News of these transfers reached the camps in America and caused absolute panic. The prisoners knew that conditions in France were catastrophic. France was starving, its infrastructure destroyed, and its populace understandably filled with a vengeful fury toward Germans. Reports trickled back of German prisoners in French hands dying of malnutrition, being beaten by guards who had been former resistance fighters, or being blown up while clearing minefields by hand without proper equipment. Suddenly, the golden cage of America seemed like paradise. Prisoners who had spent years longing for home now desperately petitioned camp commanders to let them stay in the United States. They volunteered for any extra work, displayed exaggerated good behavior, and begged American farmers to sponsor them as immigrants immediately, which was legally impossible at the time. This period, from mid-1945 to mid-1946, was crucial. It reinforced the American experience as uniquely positive. As they watched their comrades being shipped off to what they viewed as slave labor in France or Britain, their appreciation for American abundance and legal protection deepened into a fierce loyalty. They realized that the humane treatment they had received was not standard operating procedure in war. It was an exceptionally American anomaly. During this final year, as shipping shortages delayed mass repatriation, the U.S. Army relaxed fraternization rules significantly. The fiction of non-interaction was dropped. In towns like Alva, Oklahoma, or Hearne, Texas, it became borderline normal to see groups of German POWs unguarded attending the local movie theater on a Saturday night, spending their accumulated canteen scrip. They were invited to church socials openly. Some even formed local soccer teams that played against high school sides. It was a surreal twilight period. They were still prisoners, yet increasingly treated like guests who had overstayed their welcome but were well-liked nonetheless. They were our Germans now to many communities. When the orders finally came in 1946 to ship them all out, it wasn't just the prisoners who were sad. Many American communities genuinely mourned the loss of a reliable workforce and, stranger still, the loss of the quiet, polite young men who had become fixtures at their dinner tables and church pews. The departure was not the triumphant expulsion of a hated enemy, but a surprisingly melancholy farewell to men who had become a strange, integral part of the American home front. The eventual return to Germany in 1946 and 1947 was a brutal, disorienting shock that cemented their American experience as something almost mythological. They left a land where they had grown fat on 3 square meals a day, where they had slept in heated barracks and earned wages, to arrive in a moonscape of utter devastation. Germany was a broken nation. Major cities like Hamburg, Cologne, and Berlin were little more than vast fields of rubble, inhabited by Trümmerfrauen, the rubble women, who were clearing millions of tons of debris by hand. The economy had collapsed entirely. The Reichsmark was worthless, replaced by a barter economy where American cigarettes were the true currency. People were freezing in cellars and surviving on official rations that sometimes dropped to 700 calories a day, less than a quarter of what they had been eating in the American camps. In this desperate hunger winter of 1946–47, the connections they had forged in America became literal lifelines. Thousands of former prisoners, now starving civilians, wrote desperate letters to the farmers and families they had worked for in Iowa, Texas, and Nebraska. They didn't write as conquered enemies begging for mercy. They wrote as former employees and friends asking for help. The response from America was one of the great unheralded humanitarian achievements of the 20th century. It wasn't just the government's Marshall Plan, it was a grassroots deluge of individual kindness. American families, many of whom had lost their own sons fighting the Germans, began sending care packages by the tens of thousands to the very men who had once been their prisoners. These packages, filled with coffee, sugar, flour, lard, tinned meat, and warm woolen clothing, meant the difference between life and death for countless German families. One former POW, returning to a starving Hamburg, wrote to the farmer he had worked for in Minnesota. A month later, a 20-pound package arrived. He later wrote, "That package didn't just feed my family for a month. It restored my faith that there was still goodness in the world. It proved that what I experienced in America wasn't a dream, but a reality we could aspire to." This legacy profoundly shaped the future of Europe. The nearly 400,000 men who returned from American camps became the founding generation of the Federal Republic of Germany. Having lived inside a functioning, prosperous democracy, they were inoculated against the totalitarian temptations of both reviving Nazism and the new threat of Soviet communism. They knew democracy wasn't just weak, decadent chaos, as Hitler had claimed. They had seen its immense industrial power and its surprising moral strength firsthand. They became the teachers, mayors, civil servants, and fathers of the new West Germany. They taught their children not about the glory of the fatherland, but about the rule of law, the value of a free press, and the strange decency of the American people. When the Cold War began and West Germany needed to rearm as part of NATO, these men didn't build a new Wehrmacht. They built the Bundeswehr, an army explicitly designed as a defender of democracy, modeled partly on what they had observed of the U.S. military citizen-soldier ethos. 50 years later, in the 1990s, as these men entered the final years of their lives, a remarkable phenomenon occurred. Thousands of them began making pilgrimages back to the United States. They didn't come to see New York or Hollywood. They rented cars and drove to tiny, forgotten towns in rural America, to sites that were now just empty fields where barracks once stood. They came to find the farm families who had invited them to dinner. The reunions were deeply emotional. Gray-haired German grandfathers embraced elderly American widows. They sat on the same porches where they had once nervously drunk lemonade as young prisoners. They introduced their children and grandchildren to each other. These weren't meetings between former enemies. They were reunions of a strange, disparate family forged in the unlikeliest of crucibles. The story of the German POWs in America is a powerful reminder that the most lasting victories are not always won with fire and steel. The United States defeated the Wehrmacht with overwhelming force, yes, but it defeated Nazism in the hearts of 400,000 men with something far more potent: the simple, undeniable example of a free society that refused to lose its own humanity, even while fighting a total war. They came as prisoners of a hateful ideology. They left as ambassadors of a better way of life. And in the end, that was the greatest victory of all.